Hello, it's Matt here from Christ the Rock. It's really great to be able to share with you as we start our new series on overcoming. Particularly welcome if you're part of our community here in Yate, but also if you are joining us perhaps maybe for the first time or one of the first times, you are especially welcome. This series, Overcoming, is I think a really important one for our community at this point. We're living in a season where people are facing all kinds of challenges. And the call on all of us is to be people who don't simply endure or who don't simply get through the weeks and months ahead, but actually with God at our side, with God with us, that we might be people who overcome. We're going to look at several different stories across these next few weeks of examples of this in the Bible, of occasions where God's people really had their backs against the wall, against enormous odds, and yet with God's help, they were able to overcome. And the hope is that even though many of those situations will seem quite different to our own, actually we'll be able to glean lessons from them that will help us for today. We're going to start by looking at one of the most famous stories of overcoming in the whole Bible, with the character of Daniel. I'm sure many of us will know something about Daniel. He had some particularly important prophecies about Jesus, but actually most of his story was one that actually perhaps has some echoes for what some of us might be experiencing. His story begins with him being separated from his family and friends as the Babylonians, the enemies of God's people at this point, came into his land and took him away from them. Daniel as well, he faced the difficulty of, after this, living under the oppression of a foreign ruler. And then lastly, he was living under constant threat of his life. And again, whilst this obviously is very, very different to what we're experiencing at the moment, I'm sure some of us at least can sympathise with those feelings of being separated from people, separated from those that perhaps we wish we were with. And similarly, even though we aren't living under the oppression of any kind of other ruler at this point, I'm sure many of us feel the pressure on our society at the moment as posed by this virus. And as we look forwards, perhaps we can echo some of the uncertainty that I'm sure Daniel would have felt as well. But we're going to look at one moment in particular in Daniel's story that comes from Daniel chapter 6. And I'm just going to run through it over the next couple of minutes and then pick out one verse in particular that I'd like to focus on. So in chapter 6 we find Daniel actually quite a good moment for him. It opens speaking of the king of the Babylonians at this point, King Darius. And it says, "It pleased King Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with chief ministers over them." So Darius is setting up his kingdom with all these different leaders. And one of these chief leaders was Daniel. The satraps are made accountable to them so the king might not suffer loss. And Daniel became so distinguished amongst these people that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And it's just a small aside, but it is interesting that even someone like Daniel, who was enduring these terrible difficulties at this point, he could still flourish, he could still blossom at this moment. And even though that's not what we're going to kind of focus on for this next few minutes, it's something that should encourage us. But then as the story goes on, we find that the leaders around Daniel obviously felt threatened by his presence. And so they went to King Darius and they convinced him to pass a law banning worship and prayer to anyone apart from him. And then in verse 10, we find Daniel's response to this. In verse 10, we read that when Daniel learned that this decree, this law had been published, he went home to the upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then the story continues. He gets found by the leaders beneath him. They go to King Darius. Darius has to put into action this law, and Daniel is thrown into the lion's den to what most people would believe would be his definite death. But night passes. Darius comes to assuming to take out his carcass, but out Daniel comes and says these words: "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight." And clearly, this is a story of God's faithfulness, isn't it? This is a story of what God can do to somebody when they're even at their lowest ebb. And yet I think as well as that, there is a lesson here for us. There's a sign for us perhaps of how Daniel lived at this moment that showed us how he was the kind of person who would overcome the challenge set before him. And my belief, as I've been reading and meditating on this passage over this last week, is that what set Daniel apart from those around him was one thing, and it was his faithfulness. As God was being faithful to him, as God was going to continue being faithful to him, so Daniel himself showed a faithfulness to God in return. And I think in verse 10, and even actually just half of verse 10, we see three sides, three characteristics of Daniel's faithfulness. First of all, when verse 10 reads, we see that Daniel, his response to hearing this law, this decree being passed, whereas if you're anything like me, we kind of started to mope or feel grumbly or whatever, Daniel instead, we read 3 times a day, he got on his knees. And I think this shows us that the first thing Daniel was faithful in was he was faithful in humble worship to God. That in the face of adversity, rather than fleeing, rather than retreating, he chose to bow down and humbly worship the God he believed in. And across the Bible, we see that this posture of bowing down is one that is typically associated with worship. We see it in the Psalms at numerous points where the psalmist calls people to bow down in worship to the Lord, to kneel before the Lord our Maker. We see it in the life of Jesus, where many of the people who are set free, who are healed by him, their immediate response is to kneel and give thanks and praise. We see it perhaps in one of my favourite stories in the Bible of Mary when she comes to Jesus and washes his feet. This beautiful sign of worship, and yet it begins with her kneeling before him. One of my favourite theologians, John Wimber, says that worship is the one thing that belongs to God alone. I'm sure many of us are feeling called in different ways to live out our faith. Some of us might feel a certain call of evangelism, or to serve the poor, or to pray for the sick, and yet all of us are called to worship. John Ortberg, a well-known American writer, he wrote this about worship. He said, "I need to worship because without it I lose a sense of wonder and gratitude, and I plod through life with the blinders on." And I think it's interesting that kind of with Wimber and Ortberg, you see two sides to worship. Wimber recognises it's perhaps one of the only things we do purely for God. And yet Ortberg recognises that it's something that has immense benefit for ourselves. I wonder perhaps as we read this verse, as Daniel bows down in worship, as Daniel's eyes go low, so there's a sense, I think, of when he turns to prayer, when he turns to giving thanks, of God lifting his vision upwards. And for us, I'm sure many of us at this moment in this season, we have concerns, we have anxieties around us. We have things, if you like, that might pull our eyes down low, that might leave us feeling like we're just, like Ortberg said, plodding through each day. And yet worship of God as we look to him can be our true source of freedom. So first of all, he was faithful in worship. Secondly, he was faithful in prayer. As Daniel got down on his knees, his action was to pray. Abraham Lincoln said, in his life, I've been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for that day. And you know, the more that this season goes on, the more I kind of, in my own way, I guess, echo something of what Lincoln is saying there, as it becomes increasingly clear that for me personally, for our community, for our nation, as we think of our governments and businesses, that our wisdom, that our ability is not sufficient for this day. And what that should lead to, for us, for people who have faith in God, is prayer. This past week, I was listening to an interview with someone called John Mark Comer, who I think I've mentioned a couple of times before. And he was being asked about how he was responding to the current season, the current difficulties that he and his church was facing. And he was incredibly honest. He said that actually he was feeling a heightened anxiety at this point. And yet what was interesting is that this anxiety, this increased uncertainty for the future, was leading him to pray more. And I think there's something there for us, for those of us perhaps who are feeling unsure of what the next steps are, for those of us who are perhaps searching for some kind of wisdom, some kind of answer, that actually what God's desire is for us is not just that we would seek to be wise and plan and strategize, but also we would come to him in prayer. And just 2 quick points about Daniel's prayer at this moment that I think are helpful to think about for ourselves. First of all, Daniel's prayer was practical. We read that when Daniel learned this decree had been published, when this law had come into effect that he couldn't pray towards anyone else other than King Darius, his response was to go to his upstairs room. And it doesn't say why he did this, but for me, I wonder whether he was doing it so that he could practically keep praying, even though his situation had changed. I don't know what this means for you, but I know for me, one of the challenges I've found in my own prayer life at this time is I find it much more difficult to pray at home. And maybe that's just me. Maybe you love praying in your front room, I don't know. But I find I'm just increasingly distracted. And so I've had to put certain things in place just to ensure I pray more. So going out for regular prayer walks, arranging meetings online with other people just to make sure that I've got these regular points in my week and in my day to pray. So Daniel prayed practically, but he also prayed immediately. But actually there's only really half a verse between Daniel hearing this decree being published and his immediate response of prayer. And yes, sometimes I think when we talk of prayer, we can think it's about having the right candles lit and the right music on in the background and the right kind of space set up and everyone else is out of the house. And whilst God appreciates, I'm sure, these efforts we make, there's something I think quite encouraging about that fact that Daniel was moved to immediate response. And that for us in this season, prayer doesn't have to be something we simply carve out time for, but actually we can echo something that Paul describes as the continual prayer. That when we're in Tesco's queuing all the way around the back of the store, we can pray for the people around us. That when we're looking at these news stories each day, as we're trying to make sense of what's going on, we can pray as we read. That when we're on the phone to somebody and maybe they're offloading of their own anxieties, their own struggles, that we can pray as we listen. So Daniel was faithful in worship, he was faithful in prayer, and then just lastly, briefly, he was faithful in thanksgiving. We read that 3 times he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God. And this past Sunday, when we gave space for testimonies over these past few months, I just found that lifted my spirit so much. Even though I felt aware of all the difficulties people were facing, even though I felt aware from having made contact with people of the complexity of many people's situations, I just knew when I heard these stories of God's faithfulness, that our hopes and our spirits would be lifted. And I think there's something powerful here, even though sometimes it can seem trite to say that actually when we give thanks to God, when we remember the blessings he's given us, when we think about the people he's placed around us, when we think about the food in our shelves, when we think about the prayers he's answered already, when we turn our eyes to the things he's done already, so that lifts our spirits for whatever may come. So I'm just going to pray for those things for us. And I just really encourage you, as you go into this next few days ahead, this next week, just think about your own faithfulness at this point. As God is faithful to you, can we be people who continue to be faithful to him? So God, I just lift up myself. You might want to open your hands in front of you as well as a sign of coming to God. And we say, Lord, may you help us to be faithful people. May we be faithful in our worship. May we be faithful in our prayer. And may we be faithful in giving thanks. In your name, Lord, by the power of your Spirit and your Son. Amen.